Hey, welcome everybody to this event on campaigning for an arms embargo of Israel. My name is Alberto Toscano, and I would like to welcome our speakers and audience on behalf of the sponsors and organizers of this event. Faculty for Palestine at Simon Fraser University, the Decolonise Palestine Teaching Collective, and the Jewish Faculty Network. I'm very grateful to the comrades at Progressive International, whose call for an arms embargo of Israel, signed by 200 legislators from 13 countries, was a spur for organizing this event. I want to thank in particular James Schneider, Varsha Gandikota, and Jody Dean for making it possible for us to host two of the parliamentarians who signed that letter. Nikki Ashton, NDP MP for Churchill, Kewatinuk Aski in Manitoba, and Yone Belala, former Spanish Minister for Social Rights, and Podemos MP from Madrid. We will begin with a presentation by Nikki, followed by a video that Yone prepared for our meeting, and we'll then hear from Rachel Small, the Canada organizer for World Beyond War, a group that has done valiant work to put the question of an arms embargo of Israel at the forefront of struggles for social justice. Let me also thank Kylie Broderick for providing indispensable technical and logistical support for this event. As we meet to discuss how to bring to an end the genocidal brutality that Israel is inflicting on the Palestinian people, I also want to acknowledge that I am speaking from the traditional, unceded, and occupied territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam First Nations, and to mark the importance but also the challenges of thinking and acting across distinct, if interlocking, histories of colonial violence and dispossession, and of anti-colonial and Indigenous resistance. As many of you know, and as our speakers will further explore, Canada has continued to authorize military exports to Israel since the beginning of the assault on Gaza and its people, while trying to hide its complicity under the fatuous claim that we are dealing with non-lethal equipment. Some of these exports were greenlit after human rights experts and legal scholars were arguing that there was a plausible case for genocide. And as the death count mounted into the tens of thousands, the Canadian government also publicized its intent to purchase Israeli missile systems that have been used against the population of Gaza. And although the Liberal government was eventually pushed into backing a motion to cease the further authorization and transfer of arms exports to Israel, this only covers future weapons orders, and all authorized transfers will proceed, it seems. Though very modest and insufficient step, this motion was still cited as precedent in a letter coordinated by the UK Labour MP Zara Sultana, also a signatory to the Progressive International letter, signed by over 100 of her colleagues, demanding Great Britain impose an arms embargo as Israel flouted the UN ceasefire resolution. The UK has yet to cease its own sales, despite leaks showing that its own lawyers have told it Israel is in breach of international law. Here in Canada, a parliamentary petition launched by Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East and sponsored by NDP Foreign Affairs critic Heather McPherson, calling for a two-way arms embargo, was the 9th largest petition in parliamentary history and will soon be tabled. Meanwhile, as the Israeli army's atrocities against civilians, healthcare workers, international aid workers, and journalists, ranging from mass starvations to executions, continue to mount and be recorded in unspeakably graphic detail, there seems to be no end to Israel's impunity. The US State Department, which has taken post-truth foreign policy to new lows, officially argues that Israel remains in compliance with National Security Memorandum 20, which requires countries in receipt of US weaponry to make credible assurance that they are not violating international humanitarian law. The UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese recently published her report, The Anatomy of a Genocide. Its first recommendation is, I quote, "Immediately implement an arms embargo in Israel as it appears to have failed to comply with the binding measures ordered by the ICJ on 26 January 2024, as well as other economic and political measures necessary to ensure an immediate and lasting ceasefire and to restore respect for international law, including sanctions." End of quote. Our discussion today centers on the imperative need to force our government, so complicit with Israel's impunity, to stop feeding a killing machine that would grind to a halt without the unceasing provision of military equipment which is making many companies in our own states obscenely wealthy. And this is not just a matter of parliaments. The arms embargo must also be thought of in the context of the broader movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions in our workplaces and communities. In that spirit, before I give the floor to our speakers, I wanted to note the initiative advanced by Faculty for Palestine at Simon Fraser University and supported by numerous colleagues and organizations to divest the university from all corporations engaged in military arms production, companies that have enabled and profited from Israel's mass violence against Palestinians, as well as from the slaughter of civilians in the thousands in Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and elsewhere. And you can find links to those documents in our chat. I would now like to invite Nikki Ashton to speak. She will be followed by a video from Yone Belala and a presentation by Rachel Small. We will then have some time for questions. For members of the audience who are interested in posing a question to one of our two live speakers, you can send those questions to the address that will be in the chat, ccms@sfu.ca, and they will be passed on to us. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Nikki, who's kindly joined us today.
Thank you, Alberto. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm joining you today from Treaty 5 territory, my hometown of Thompson in northern Manitoba, on the traditional territory of the Nishnawasi Cree Nation. I would like to thank Faculty for Palestine, SFU, and Decolonise Palestine Teach-In for the invitation to take part in today's event, campaigning for an arms embargo of Israel. Today's discussion is critical for so many reasons. The genocide in Gaza is ongoing as we speak. Over 32,705 Palestinians have been killed, over 75,000 people wounded. According to UNICEF, over 13,000 Palestinian children have been killed. Entire families, generations wiped out. 1.7 million Palestinians have been displaced in Gaza. In just the last few days, we saw the destruction of the Al-Shifa hospital, one of the biggest hospitals in Gaza. We all shared our collective shock when Israel bombed the first hospital months ago. Now, 178 days later, multiple hospitals have been destroyed, leaving thousands dead and wounded with nowhere to go. Today, we are grappling with the news that 7 aid workers with World Central Kitchen, including a Canadian citizen, were killed in a targeted airstrike by Israel. More than 196 aid workers have been killed in Gaza in the last few months. Aid workers, journalists, doctors, poets, grandparents, parents, daughters, sons, women, men, children, slaughtered. I, like many others, spoke out and condemned the October 7th attacks against civilians and the taking of hostages. But let's be clear. What's happened since that time has nothing to do with self-defense. Last week, UN Rapporteur Francesca Albanese, speaking at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, presented her latest report, entitled Anatomy of a Genocide. She stated, following nearly 6 months of unrelenting Israeli assault on occupied Gaza, it is my solemn duty to report on the worst of what humanity is capable of and to present my findings. She went on to say, there are reasonable grounds to believe that the threshold indicating the commission of the crime of genocide has been met. Even the UN Security Council has now voted for a ceasefire, given the US's abstention. But the genocide is ongoing. And the question is, what is Canada doing? Let's be clear, Canada has been and continues to be complicit in Israel's genocide in Gaza and its attacks on the West Bank. We'll get to the arms trade in a minute and further into today's discussion. But first, we must make it clear that Canada has been complicit through the political cover it has given Netanyahu and his extreme right-wing government. Canada has failed to take action against Netanyahu and others in key positions in the Israeli government who are inciting and engaging in genocide. Canada took too long to vote for a ceasefire at the UN and has done little to back it up. Canada has been a coward at the ICC, has done nothing to support South Africa's position or advocate for an end to the genocide and for justice and peace. Canada piled on with other countries and defunded UNRWA, knowing fully well that UNRWA is the only agency that can do the life-saving work necessary in Gaza. As a result, a dire situation became worse. We were all shocked by the Flower Massacre. Canada, a country that has prided itself on supporting and believing in the UN, has done nothing to decry the targeting and killing of UN workers and officials. Canada claims to support a two-state solution, but repeatedly refuses to recognize a Palestinian state. And the list goes on. We must be clear that anything Canada has done, from the vote at the UN to the reinstatement of funding for UNRWA, has been the result of immense public pressure. Canada, a country that has prided itself on being a world leader on human rights, a country that helped build the UN, a country that has played a peacekeeping role in the Middle East in the past and supported the Oslo Accords, today is not on the side of human rights, peace, and justice, but rather on the side of war and genocide. And nowhere is that clearer than in our ongoing arms trade with Israel. Canadians have been clear. They want to see Canada support a ceasefire. They want Canada to stop arming Israel. Tens of thousands of Canadians have mobilized, telling their MPs, Minister Joly, Prime Minister Trudeau, that a clear arms embargo must be put in place. As a member of Parliament, I have felt strongly about the need for an arms embargo for years, and I've supported organizations and activists in Canada who have led this work. In recent months, it has become painfully clear why it is needed. Israel is one of the most heavily armed countries in the world, thanks to the United States' financial and military support, and thanks to Western countries, including Canada. But recent months have proven that little will deter Netanyahu and others from pushing genocide in Gaza and committing war crimes against Palestinians using these arms. Thanks to groundbreaking progressive reporting, we know Canada exported $28 million worth of arms parts and technology since October 7th. People here in Canada and around the world have pushed back. We have seen clear solidarity here at home and around the world. Progressives around the world have been taking this fight to their parliaments. I signed the Progressive International letter along with hundreds of parliamentarians such as Iona Belara, Jeremy Corbyn, Rashida Tlaib, and others. Because just as many of our governments support war, we know that people in our countries support peace. Peace, which includes freedom for Palestine. Here in Canada, we in the NDP have done important work to push for an immediate arms embargo, but there is a lot more work to do. The Liberals are masters of saying one thing and doing another. As a result of immense public pressure, they have said they will bring in an embargo, but what they're saying is not good enough. The reality is Canada needs to bring in a two-way arms embargo, which is what is really needed at this time. Canada needs to stop producing arms technology and parts and exporting it to Israel. But we must go much further. We need to cancel existing permits and licenses. We must stop partnerships with Israeli arms manufacturers and others that sell arms and arms technology to Israel. We need to stop importing arms and surveillance technology from Israel. We need to refuse to have ports and airports used for transferring arms to Israel. Canadians have been clear for months. Canada cannot remain complicit in genocide. Politicians like Trudeau and Joly cannot speak from both sides of their mouth, all the while continuing to provide political and military cover for Israel. Not to mention Poilievre and the Conservatives who are cheerleading a genocide. By refusing to take action against Netanyahu, refusing to recognize a Palestinian state, and refusing to move on a two-way arms embargo, Canada remains complicit. It is time for Canada to once again be a voice for peace and justice in Palestine and around the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nikki, for a really powerful presentation. Many things for us to discuss, and above all, many things for us to follow up on in our own action here and elsewhere. And hopefully we'll have a chance to talk to you a little bit about that after our other presentations. Now we'll have a video from one of your fellow parliamentarians who signed the Progressive International letter, Iona Belara. So maybe we can have that. Here we go. The video is muted now, so I can try that again. Kylie, I can't Can anyone else hear this or?
Okay, give me 1 second.
Yeah, it was working fine when we tested it, so. Bear with us 1 minute.
Alberto, could you just go to the next one? It's asking for a setting change for some reason now for me.
Sorry, so should we just ask Rachel to do her presentation and then we'll do the Yonibelada talk after?
Yeah.
Okay. Rachel? Okay, so thank you very much, Rachel, for anticipating your talk by a few minutes, and I'll give you the floor.
Thanks so much. We've all been there with Zoom. They change their settings every day. But yeah, thanks so much for having me, and thank you for the really comprehensive interview and for what you shared as well. Sorry, for the comprehensive introduction, Alberto, and for what you shared as well, Nikki. So my name's Rachel. I'm the Canada organizer with World Beyond War. We're a global grassroots abolitionist organization, really a network of activists, volunteers, allied organizations all around the world who are advocating for the end of war and the institution of war and the military-industrial complex. And we're working via, I think it's now 34 chapters in 22 countries, members in at least 197 countries worldwide, all working, all day, every day to debunk the myths of war, to take concrete steps to really build an alternative global security system that is based on demilitarizing, on managing conflict nonviolently, on creating a culture of peace. That's what we do all the time. And then, of course, just the urgent need for this work has really been in the forefront these past few months. I've been asked today to speak about the campaign for an arms embargo that we've been honored to be part of for the past, well, really, we've been pushing for an arms embargo in Israel for many years, but then I would say especially within the past almost 6 months at this point, this campaign has come to the forefront as we've all been witnessing what's already been described here today, just the truly horrific genocidal violence that's being live streamed to our phones every single day from Palestine. And at the same time, as we've been witnessing this violence, really hundreds of thousands of folks across so-called Canada have been rising up in really unprecedented ways to take action to end it. I want to specifically give a shout out, of course, to the leadership of Palestinians around the world and here across so-called Canada, but specifically to the Palestinian youth movement, who have really been emphasizing the need to end Canadian complicity in Israeli military violence from day one, and really taking a hard look at what that entails. Of course, there are many important angles to look at in terms of Canadian complicity in what the Israeli military is doing right now. But I think one important place that many have coalesced around here is an arms embargo, because really, like, what complicity could be more blatant than the Canadian government continuing to approve and Canadian companies continuing to send the literal weapons that are being used to slaughter Palestinians before our eyes right now. And frankly, because without the support of weapons from Canada, from the US, from Europe, the violence that the state of Israel is carrying out right now would literally not be possible. So for those reasons, this campaign, I think, has really come to the fore. And I should give a shout out to the Palestinian trade unions, who have consistently really had one ask since October, and that's that the world needs to stop arming Israel. So maybe I'll take a second just to say kind of what is the Canada-Israel arms trade? What are we talking about here when we're talking about an arms embargo? So essentially, we're talking about the flow of military goods to and from Israel and Canada. So on one hand, that's the export of weapons. So weapons and military components and products that are produced by Canadian companies from truly coast to coast, and that the Canadian government, specifically through Global Affairs Canada, gives permits for companies to be able to then sell to Israel. And then there's Canada's importing of military goods as well, which is primarily for our own military to use. So this flow goes both ways. Maybe I will chance my luck here with the sharing screen. There's no sound in what I would like to show, so hopefully this will work out. Can you see that okay? Great. So I wanted to just share, just to give a sense of the scale here, I'm going to take you to, well, to our own website. It's just worldbeyondwar.org/Canada Stop Arming Israel. If you go there and if you scroll down a bit, you'll see we've put together a map that shows at this point, I think we've gotten over 200, it doesn't look like that many, but we've gotten over 200 dots on this map really across the country that show where there is a company that's involved in arming Israel, in this case, in sending weapons to Israel. So, I mean, because this event is based out of Simon Fraser, let's zoom in just here in the Vancouver area just to get a sense of really how many companies in the places where we live are involved in this. In some cases, basically right in our backyards, or weapons are traveling on the highways right by our houses without us even knowing. So let's look at what we have here. We've got Palantir, Thales, Hikvision. So I'll say right off the bat, Palantir and Hikvision are both companies that are involved in the surveillance of the Palestinian civilian population. So they sell surveillance cameras, they sell AI, like predictive policing systems. Who else do we have here, right in kind of the school's backyard? We've got Boeing, several Boeing facilities, Northrop Grumman. So Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and Thales that I pointed to earlier are some of the largest weapons companies on Earth. Boeing is the world's third largest military company. Northrop Grumman, I believe, is the sixth largest. Thales also has had a relationship arming Israel for many, many decades. So these companies provide the major weapon systems that Israel is using to decimate Gaza right now. So that's the SAR-5 warships, the Apache attack helicopters, some of the systems involved in their fighter jets, the F-15, the F-35 fighter jets. Boeing is involved in also making the precision-guided bomb kits. So if you're looking at the decimation and the slaughter of thousands of civilians in Palestine, these are the companies that are making components, or in some cases, the entire weapons systems. Entire weapon systems are not being made at these particular facilities, but components for these fighter jets, these warships, these drones, these helicopters absolutely are. And then who do we have here? We have Late Core, ASCO. So these are companies that are much smaller, and they make parts for Lockheed Martin's F-35. So this is the most modern fighter jet. This is the one dropping the bombs that are in some cases thousands of pounds per missile on Gaza. So I'll stop screen sharing here, but just to give an idea at really any part of the country, nearly any part of the country that you look closer at, you will find the Canada-Israel arms trade. This is not something happening over there. This is something happening really right where we live. So, I mean, knowing this and increasingly finding this out over the past few months, we've been working with first a small number and now a very, very large number of people all across the country who are really saying, like, knowing this, knowing that there are these weapons companies in our neighborhoods and across Canada who are arming and frankly making a fortune off of arming Israel and off of the massacre of Palestinians by selling these weapons, we cannot in good conscience stand by. We have to do something about this. And amidst the just like the heartbreaking, unspeakable horror of the past few months, I have to say that witnessing just the deep commitment of many, many thousands of people across the country who've just made it very clear that until the Canadian government stops the flow of weapons to Israel, we are going to do it ourselves. We're going to take any action that we can to stop a genocide. And that has been deeply heartening and I think a real sign of humanity in these times and what social movements are capable of. So what does that look like? I mean, I think we've all seen protests on the street every single week in every, not just city, but basically every town across this country. But also, I've lost track at this point, but over 50 direct actions. So people not just protesting and demonstrating, but physically blocking, in many cases, weapons companies. So literally, in some cases, hundreds, in some cases, a dozen people actually blocking the entrances for cars, for workers at their local weapons factory to say, we're not going to let your business as usual continue while you're arming genocide. Just this morning, in fact, there are several dozen people in Longueuil, just outside of Montreal, blocked all entrances and facilities of Heru DevTech, a large Canadian company that is involved in the F-35 production for Israel. So this is continuing every single day. And then at the same time as there have been these protests, there's this direct actions, we've also been working with incredible lawyers across the country who are launching legal challenges. So just a month or so ago, folks with CLAIR, Canadian Lawyers for International Human Rights, launched a lawsuit, in fact, suing the Canadian government in federal courts for not following its own laws around the approval of weapons permits. Turns out Canadian laws themselves say that where there is risk of Canadian military goods, lethal or non-lethal is not even in the wording of any Canadian law, where there is risk of any Canadian military goods being used to commit war crimes, to commit crimes against humanity, to against human rights, Canada needs to not export those weapons to that place. So they're calling the Canadian government out by suing them in Canadian courts. At the same time, there's been enormous advocacy efforts, some of which were mentioned by speakers earlier, whether that's through motions in Parliament, whether that's petitions, press conferences, reports, everyone sort of putting pressure on the government to change what's happening. And then I also want to give a shout out to a lot of the research that's happening behind the scenes. As Nikki mentioned earlier, it was the Maple, a small independent paper that, and really thanks, I want to give credit to reporter Alex Kosh with the Maple, who has just been absolutely tireless in filing access to information requests and doggedly pursuing Global Affairs Canada until they admitted the truth, which is that despite what politicians were saying, they were indeed continuing to send weaponry to Israel, and in fact at record-breaking amounts during October through December. And I also want to give a shout out to Project Plowshares, incredible peace think tank, and frankly to the many unnamed researchers who are spending long hours in front of spreadsheets so that we can have the map that I showed you earlier, so that we can have this information, so that we can take action. This is some of the unglamorous work of anti-war organizing is the deep research. So all of these efforts have been coalescing over the past few months. People have been just unceasing in their demand that we need to stop the flow of weapons to and from Israel. And and then of course what we saw a couple of weeks ago was the motion that was mentioned earlier, the non-binding motion, followed by an announcement by Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly that the Canadian government would stop approving future weapons permits to Israel, or would pause doing so. So I just again want to, well, first of all, I want to say that this is, I'll talk about why this is far less than what we need, but I do want to say this is a big deal and is a testament to just the incredible mobilizing, especially at the grassroots level across the country over the past few months under the leadership of Palestinian communities and activists and people of all ages, and is a huge break from Canada's long-term foreign policy with Israel. So this is a big deal. It's something that, as Alberto mentioned, has been followed on the global stage and is really setting an example for other countries. However, what Joly announced is unfortunately not yet an arms embargo. And so this campaign continues. So maybe to clarify where it's lacking, maybe I'll actually just read the definition of an arms embargo from the Canadian government's own website. So it says, promise this is short. It says, an arms embargo aims to prevent weapons and military equipment from leaving or reaching a targeted country, It prohibits exporting and importing arms and related material to and from the targeted country. So that's what the Global Affairs Canada defines as an arms embargo. And so as of March, while the Canadian government has promised to sort of pause authorizations on any future theoretical arms export permits to Israel, well, first of all, they haven't even formalized this policy yet. If this is government policy, we expect to actually see it on the Global Affairs Canada website where such policies are posted. We expect to see the notice to exporters. You know what? Maybe I'll share something visual at the same time as I'm saying this. This is our take on the checklist and where we're at on the route to an arms embargo. So we have number one, which is again a big win. We have a commitment from the government. They're not going to approve more permits. What we don't yet have is everything else. So we don't have, again, this recognized an official government policy. This shouldn't be something we have to rely on. Something Melanie Joly said to a reporter. If this is what the government's policy, this should be reflected in government policy. Then what we need to see is for the weapons that were already approved before this new pause came into place to also not be sent to Israel. If it's not acceptable right now for Canada to approve more weapons exports to Israel, it is also not acceptable to send any more weapons to Israel. And frankly, I think it makes a mockery of our demand for them to say, okay, we're pausing any new permits and expect that we don't know that they just approved a record-breaking number of permits to Israel. So every permit that they've approved, they also need to not let those weapons get on ships and go to Israel. And then we have to close the loophole that right now doesn't even track weapons and military goods that go to Israel via the United States. So for example, before when we were talking about parts of the F-35, of the really horrific fighter jet that's being used to bomb Gaza right now, the parts, there's first of all hundreds of facilities in Canada that make parts for the F-35. This is considered the most advanced fighter jet on the planet. They all are sent to a facility in the US where they're built into the fighter jet system that is then exported to Israel. Canada is not even tracking this right now. So we need to make sure that they can't get away with arming Israel because they first put it on a truck to the US. And then finally, as per the Canadian government's own definition of an arms embargo, it needs to involve also not buying weapons from Israel. This is really important because Canada, first of all, is one of Israel's biggest military customers right now, 6th in the world, which is huge given just adjusted per capita for Canada and based on our GDP. It's also a big deal because Israel has been very clear in saying that the way that they intend to fund their current genocide and it has been astronomically expensive right now, their military operations, and the way they're going to pay back that is by selling military goods overseas. And these are goods that are explicitly marketed as battle tested on Palestinians, clearly. So by continuing to purchase weaponry from Israel and by in fact signing new deals to buy weapons from Israel, as Bill Blair, Minister of Defense, just did last month, we're directly funding Israel's war effort and directly putting capital into the exact same companies, many of whom are state-owned, that are carrying out the violence on Palestinians right now. So it's not enough to simply not send weapons to Israel. We also need to not be funding them by buying them from Israel. So that's kind of a bit of a look at where we're at, I would say, in the campaign for an arms embargo. And I'll stop there, but I'd be happy to answer any future questions.
Thank you so much, Rachel, especially for the detail and specificity of what you've told us about the campaign and for making it very clear that we're surrounded by the material infrastructure that's enabling what is happening in Gaza, but also for giving us really important pointers, which hopefully we can discuss about the significance of direct action. So hopefully I'll leave Kylie to play the video, and hopefully this will work now from Yona Belada.
Buenos días, compañeras y compañeros. Es un placer para mí participar de esta mesa, aunque sea de esta forma telemática. Y en primer lugar me gustaría agradecer a las organizadoras y los organizadores la celebración de este evento y también, por supuesto, su participación a los colegas en esta mesa de debate. Considero que actos como este son imprescindibles porque necesitamos seguir hablando de Palestina. Uno de los principales objetivos que ha logrado el Estado genocida y colonial de Israel es precisamente insensibilizar a grandes capas de la población. Todavía recuerdo la estupefacción del mundo entero la primera vez que Israel bombardeó un hospital. De hecho, su primera reacción, si lo recordáis, fue negarlo, decir que habían sido cohetes perdidos de la resistencia palestina. Después de aquello, sin embargo, han bombardeado decenas de hospitales, escuelas de la UNRWA, han sobrepasado todas las líneas rojas que existen incluso en los conflictos armados. Incluso en la guerra, compañeros y compañeras, hay normas e Israel se las ha saltado todas. Precisamente esto tiene que llevarnos a darnos cuenta que lo que estamos viendo no es un conflicto armado, es un genocidio, como está señalando la propia Corte Internacional de Justicia tras la denuncia que interpuso Sudáfrica. Estamos viendo el intento deliberado por parte del Estado de Israel de aniquilar a todo un pueblo, en sus propias palabras, de hacerles desaparecer de la faz de la tierra y, en concreto, hacer la vida en la Franja de Gaza completamente imposible. Esto supera todos los límites del horror. Y creo también que se equivoca quien piensa que esto afecta solo a los palestinos y las palestinas, a sus niños y a sus niñas que mueren abrasados por las armas químicas o por los bombardeos, a quien piensa que solo les afecta a los niños y las niñas que están literalmente muriendo de hambre a unos pocos cientos de metros de donde Israel tiene bloqueada la ayuda humanitaria en el paso de Rafah. Esto no va solo del pueblo palestino, va de la humanidad entera. Porque si permitimos que les pase a ellos y a ellas, el día de mañana podrán hacérselo a cualquiera de nuestros pueblos. Precisamente que Israel esté dilapidando toda la estructura institucional internacional que construimos después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial es lo más grave de todo, porque la construimos para que nadie pudiera hacerle a nadie lo que los nazis le hicieron al pueblo judío, a las personas con discapacidad, a las personas LGTBI, a las personas, compañeros y compañeras que pensaban como nosotras. Y todo esto me lleva a la cuestión del embargo de armas, sobre la que me surgen dos reflexiones principales. La primera, que lamentablemente la mayoría de países occidentales, sus gobiernos, no están haciendo nada concreto para frenar el genocidio cometido por el Estado de Israel contra el pueblo de Palestina. No han suspendido sus relaciones diplomáticas con Israel, no han acordado embargos de armas, no han aplicado sanciones económicas que, por otra parte, sí fueron posibles contra la Rusia de Putin cuando invadió ilegalmente Ucrania. Hay mucho que podría hacerse y no se hace. ¿Y por qué? Muy simple, porque Israel tiene un amigo muy poderoso con el que nadie quiere enemistarse, los Estados Unidos de América. Y eso es dramático, porque significa que las normas internacionales se aplican distinto en función de quién seas tú y de quiénes sean tus amigos. Lo segundo es que no es verdad que todos perdamos con esta situación. Hay quien está ganando y mucho, en concreto las empresas de armamento israelíes y las empresas armamentísticas americanas. Por ejemplo, desde el pasado 7 de octubre, la multinacional estadounidense Lockheed Martin, el mayor exportador de armas del mundo, vio cómo su capitalización bursátil se había disparado un 10%. Otro dato, en 2022, empresas dedicadas a la fabricación de armas como Rheinmetall han subido en bolsa hasta el 150% y las ganancias superan el 300% respecto al año anterior. Esto se da en un contexto de aceleración de la escalada militar, de la escalada bélica que estamos viendo también en Ucrania y también en Yemen, y que está colocando a nuestro mundo al borde del precipicio. Nosotras, por ese motivo, estamos defendiendo el embargo total de armas. En nuestro caso, nos hemos enterado de que España fue el país europeo que más armas exportó a Israel en el mes de noviembre, en concreto el 52% del total. Bombas, granadas, torpedos, minas, misiles, cartuchos, proyectiles y todas sus partes, incluidas las postas, perdigones y tacos para cartuchos. Por eso estamos pidiendo el fin de la venta de armas a Israel, pero también el fin de la compra. España compró armas a filiales israelíes por valor de 300 millones de euros en el año 2023. Insisto, dinero público de todos los españoles y todas las españolas que va directamente a financiar un genocidio. Y sabemos, y nadie nos lo niega, que a través de España, que obviamente tiene una situación física estratégica privilegiada, se está transportando material militar a través de los puertos de Rota, la base aeronaval americana en suelo español, o Sagunto, también un puerto fundamental en nuestro país. A través de esos puertos se traslada material militar sin que nadie haga nada para impedirlo. Y sin embargo, el país de su gente, España, el país de nuestra gente, es el país del no a la guerra. Incluso la derecha española tiene que rechazar lo que está haciendo Israel, precisamente porque nuestro país tiene una cultura de paz muy arraigada y muy profunda. Por eso necesitamos seguir alzando la voz, necesitamos más movilización, necesitamos, porque lo sabemos muy bien, que este genocidio termine, pero no lo van a parar las élites económicas y las élites políticas que se benefician directamente del statu quo. Si alguien puede frenar este genocidio es la gente organizada y movilizada.
Okay, that was a wonderful presentation from Yone Velada, who's been really at the forefront of making these arguments in Europe and around the world in the recent period. I think Nikki will have to go, unfortunately, so we can thank her again for an extremely important and very powerful presentation. Thank you, Nikki. That was really great.
Thank you, Alberto, and thank you for bringing us together, and very inspired by Iona's words and the work that Rachel and so many are doing on the ground in this fight. My apologies for having to head out a few minutes early, but I look forward to being in touch and working in solidarity with everyone that is fighting for a full two-way arms embargo and for an end to Canada's complicity in this genocide. So, and of course, in the ongoing struggle for peace, for justice, for freedom for Palestine. Thank you very much. We'll be in touch.
Thank you so much, Nikki.
Thank you.
Thank you. So maybe we can take the opportunity of these last few minutes of our seminar to have a chat with you, Rachel, maybe to expand on what you see as the strategic and kind of tactical challenges ahead. We've had a full range, very much of, everybody was very much on the same page, but also a range of thinking both about the legislative and juridical dimensions, as well as the questions of direct action. And I was really pleased that you centered how absolutely vital the Palestinian leadership has been here in Canada and elsewhere in leading this fight for justice and for an arms embargo. So perhaps, yeah, if you had a chance, we might have some questions coming in from the audience, but if you wanted to expand a little bit on how you see these different levels of the struggle for an arms embargo and for justice in Palestine interlocking, that would be great.
Sure. I mean, I think that the Liberal government, in making sort of like continued announcements that they made kind of right after the motion was voted on, I guess 2 weeks ago now, I think they were really counting on people sort of being satisfied with that, or at least thinking like, okay, we got an arms embargo. And frankly, I was a little nervous about that too, because as you mentioned right in your introduction, they've been purposefully not going to say inventing language, but they've certainly been inventing terms that are nowhere in the discourse or in Canadian legislation or in international legislation around the transfer of arms, to sort of weasel their way out of making it seem like there even is a Canada-Israel arms trade. And then now when they finally sort of admit that there is one, they sort of make it seem like, oh, well, we've ended all that by not authorizing new permits. And conveniently, of course, yeah, don't mention that they just authorized a record-breaking amount that still haven't shipped out, nor all the arms that go, as I mentioned, kind of through the US on the way to Israel. And I think they were counting on people being fooled. And what I've seen in the past 2 weeks is that that's not the case at all. Instead of action subsiding, what I'm seeing is people escalating and people recognizing that this weekend will be 6 months since October 7th. And just as the horrific violence is continuing to be carried out by the Israeli state, and that is not slowing down, nor can our solidarity work for those of us who aren't Palestinians, or our direct resistance for those who are. And so, for example, seeing the really successful weapons blockade outside of Montreal this morning, a similar action last week in Newfoundland, where there's a company, Kraken Robotics, that supplies sonar systems directly to Elbit, which is Israel's largest weapons company. I'm seeing that people are committed to just ramping up, and I expect to see a lot more of that on the direct action front in April. I also am seeing this as a bit of a watershed moment in the country in terms of understanding the broader picture of Canadian militarism. I think, for example, now that people have learned that there are these military weapons companies all across the country, they're not going to forget that anytime soon. And the second you look into the other places where these companies are exporting weapons, I mean, it's hard to find a good case of where anyone might think, oh yes, that was an excellent use of a precision-guided 2,000-pound missile. These weapons are being used to cause horrific devastation around the world. Canada's open bases around the world that nobody knows about. I really believe that people are uncovering a whole other side to Canadian militarism that has been there all along, but that people have not been as aware of. And I think that's going to fundamentally change our understanding of Canada's role in the world, and also what we can do right here. I was glad you mentioned a divestment campaign that has been launched at SFU, and I've been seeing similar campaigns being launched across the country, whether it's Ontario teachers who just launched a campaign to divest their pension plan, whether it's people right now. The Toronto chapter of World Beyond War has a Break Up With Your Bank campaign that's supporting hundreds of people in breaking up with their bank and moving to credit unions, where they're then advocating that those credit unions don't invest in these companies. I'm seeing people, I guess what I'm trying to say is, organizing in all the spheres where they have influence, be that their kids' school, their bank, their local weapons factory, their member of parliament, or the court of law.
Thank you. Yeah, I think what was really important also is thinking about the connections, right? The fact that these are weapons companies, as Yona pointed out, that are also complicit in all kinds of violations happening in other sites as well, right? And so another question might be too, since you mentioned your abolitionist commitments as well, right? And even here at SFU, we recently had the experience of the university bringing in security guards to monitor grad union strike. They were the same ones that were used to repress indigenous blockades of pipeline building. In following these apparatuses of violence and repression, one also follows, or can potentially link, right, struggles that seem to be distant but are really not. So I was wondering if there were any links between the military dimension of this and the policing one that you thought were of particular note in the Canadian context or elsewhere.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. I mean, World Beyond War is obviously an organization focused on the military-industrial complex, but we consider abolitionist struggles to abolish the police to be absolutely sister movements in struggle, recognizing that, yeah, these institutions of state violence will always work together, and we're built to work together in that way. And I mean, I think that it's interesting to note, sort of as you did, that at the same time as we're witnessing Canadian militarism and it being part of enacting just horrific violence around the world, like we're also witnessing militarized violence that continues colonization across so-called Canada, right? And as you mentioned, sort of one of the key ways I think we see that is the ways that those who take a stand at, for example, the climate front line, so especially Indigenous people, the way that they're regularly attacked and surveilled by militarized policing, but in many cases also the Canadian military directly. I mean, I think especially for anyone who's been watching the Wet'suwet'en struggle over the past few years, it just, there's almost no clear way to see the way that, yeah, militarized forces are enacting, yeah, just terrible violence as part of really ongoing colonial warfare. And of course, the foundational war of Canada is one of colonization. And the first kind of army of Canada was the RCMP, set up as a colonial police force. I mean, or even if we look at the ways that military bases are positioned across the country in ways that continue to steal, continue to contaminate Indigenous land. I was recently just trying to wrap my head around really how much space these military bases cover. And the analogy that made most sense to me is when I found out that it's over 2 million hectares. It's really like half the landmass of Switzerland is what is covered by bases within Canada. So it's a humongous swath of land that's being used without much discussion, I would say, within Canada. Yeah, and all this is happening in a moment when the Canadian military is increasingly targeting Indigenous folks for recruitment. So I mean, yeah, all of these issues are very connected, and the relationship between policing. I mean, I think in even just a few months, we'll probably have a lot more to say looking back at this moment and the ways that Palestinian-led protest is being policed across Canada right now. But even at this moment, it's very clear that police forces across the country are working in collaboration with each other and with CSIS and with the RCMP to suppress dissent across the country. And you see that in the ways they're sharing intelligence, in the ways that they're sharing strategies, in common tactics being used by police forces across the country at this moment, whether that's the pulling up of obscure municipal codes to suddenly say that using a megaphone or a sound system is illegal, whether that's the way they're now prosecuting, at least in many parts of Ontario, I'm not sure in other places, any arrest in connection to a Palestinian protest under hate crimes legislation, regardless of what the arrest was for. There's certainly common PR strategies they're using in terms of, I mean, for example, 2 weekends ago in Toronto, there was an arrest that the police described as man arrested at pro-Palestinian rally for hate speech. What they didn't say was that this was someone, a white supremacist who showed up, who yelled white power repeatedly at the protest and then started attacking people. But there's a deliberate effort here to say, oh, this was hate speech at a pro-Palestinian rally. And it's clear that they're trying to build a narrative of our movements as becoming, as being anti-Semitic, as being increasingly violent to justify their crackdown. I won't go too far down this rabbit hole, but the trends that we're seeing now, I think, will be even more evidence in a few months from now, looking back.
Yeah, I think the vigilance and resistance to that is extremely important. I was also struck that you mentioned in your mapping of the invisible military infrastructure, or invisible to the layperson of Vancouver, that you mentioned Hikvision, which I remember being one of the protagonists of the Automating Apartheid report from Amnesty International. I taught that to my students last year, and one of the companies that Amnesty had, basically was calling to boycott, right? These systems of automated surveillance are profoundly entangled in forms of colonial policing and violence that are on a complete continuum, right, with the carrying out of war. And maybe just to finish, I was wondering if how you saw the relationship between the legislative and more macro, so to speak, political campaigns and the direct action. I saw recently that I think Palestine Action was quite successful in the UK at sequentially shutting down a number of Elbit Systems factories through various blockades. So I was just wondering if you had any final comments about the types of struggle and action that can bring about or move us closer to the arms embargo that we're all calling for.
Well, first of all, I think it's really striking that we are all calling for an arms embargo. Like, this is actually, I think, a relatively rare moment where there actually just has been so much cohesion amongst just a huge swath of groups and grassroots organizations and neighborhood groups and larger civil society and humanitarian orgs and your local cricket team. And like, there's just been huge cohesion around this is what needs to happen. And I mean, this is, I think, it's social movements kind of at their best, where we all identify what is the tactic and the approach that our group or our community or whatever is best suited to do, but then we push it forward in unison. So whether that is folks who are best suited to be lobbying in Ottawa, to be suing the Canadian government in court, to be doing some of those more top-down approaches, versus those of us who are best suited to literally block the operations for a day at our local weapons factory, or to be not letting our MP go out to dinner in the neighborhood without having to deal with a member of their neighborhood who says, what are you doing to stop genocide right now? Because you saying that you feel terribly about it is not you doing what you need to be doing right now. I think all these efforts really actually are coming together. And I mean, it's clear that any time over the past few months where Trudeau or Joly have gotten up and either shared misinformation kind of at best or lied at worst about the weapons trade, the only reason they've done that is that they're feeling an enormous amount of pressure right now. And for them to have last month taken the insufficient but still important step of not approving any further weapons deals to export weapons to Israel, that's the last thing they wanted to do. And the only reason they have done, and Israel is freaking out. Like, and all it takes is a look in mainstream media in Israel to look at what are the politicians saying about this, what is everyone saying about this. Canada has been a staunch ally of Israel for many decades, and the only reason the Liberal government took this step is because the unified pressure of folks all across the country doing whatever it is they can. So I think this is a moment where we do have power, even though we don't always see it, and where, as I said earlier, the government is counting on us to feel like we've achieved something and let up the pressure, when what we need to do is the opposite, to ramp it up. And there will be several calls at the global, at the national, and at local levels across the country over the next week or two, calling for exactly that kind of an escalation. And I frankly am expecting people to answer it, because what I've been seeing is hundreds of thousands of folks across the country really just stepping up time and again over the past few months. So I think that in the face of the devastation we're seeing, we all have to be doing everything we can. I think people will continue to do that.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was really lucid and extremely inspiring, which is just what we need in very dark times, but ones where, at least we're seeing, as you put it, so many different people, thinking that, enough is enough and things have to really change. I'd also like to thank, even though they're not here right now, Nikki and Yone and the folks at Progressive International for also bringing this forward at the parliamentary level, where the general landscape has been atrocious, but where these really principled and courageous voices are really important. So I'd like to thank you all, and hopefully once we have a recording up, you can circulate this and hopefully also use it as a kind of organizing or campaigning tool as well, whether it's in your local divestment campaigns or to promote direct action or to help out in the legislative and juridical struggles over this. So thank you all very much, and till